They told me it would be 60 days. 60 days to learn a dead man's walk, wear a dead man's face, and come home to a dead man's wife. 60 days, they said, and then I could disappear back into whatever gutter they'd pulled me from. That was the deal. That was the lie. My name is Eddie Reese. Or it was once. I was a test pilot before I was a coward, and a coward before I was a ghost, and I've been a ghost so long now that telling you this story feels like confessing from the far side of the grave. But somebody has to say it. Somebody has to say what actually happened out there, what we knew and when we knew it, and why two people who had no business caring about anything chose to care about everything. I'll start where they started it, with a boy from Houston watching a television set at 3 in the morning, seeing the first human footsteps on another world. I wasn't supposed to be watching. I was working a loading dock in Galveston, hauling freight and keeping my name out of people's mouths. I'd been doing that for 2 years since the inquest, since they put my flight record in a drawer and closed the drawer and told me I was finished. 3 people died when that interceptor went down. I'd ejected at low altitude on instinct, pure animal self-preservation, and what was left of the aircraft had come apart over a neighborhood. 3 people, a retired school teacher and 2 men eating lunch outside a tire shop. I knew their names. I still know their names. I'm not going to write them here because this isn't about them, and they deserve better than to be footnotes in my story. So I was watching a television in a break room, and Colonel Bryce Randolph was descending a ladder in his suit, and the whole world was holding its breath, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years, something that wasn't shame. Pride, maybe. The cheap, borrowed kind. The kind you feel when your country does something worth doing and you had no part in it. Randolph planted the standard and said the words they'd rehearsed for him, and then the camera feed went static. The anchors filled the silence. Technical difficulties, signal delay, everyone waited, the static held. I didn't think about it again for 6 weeks. They came for me on a Thursday. 2 men in a government sedan, civilian clothes but military spines. They knew everything, the inquest, Galveston, the address of the room I rented above a bait shop on the seawall. They sat across from me at a picnic table behind the dock and they told me that Bryce Randolph was dead, that I looked enough like him to be his brother, and that the future of the human presence beyond this world depended on what I said next. I should have laughed. I should have told them to get off my pier. I didn't. That's the thing about men who have already lost everything. They've got nothing left to protect, and nothing left to lose makes them peculiarly easy to recruit. The man who ran the Ares program was named Kurt Anderson. He met me in a conference room at the facility outside Houston 3 days later, and from the first moment I understood him clearly. He was a good man doing a bad thing, and he knew it. That combination produces a very specific look, a tightness around the eyes, a way of not quite meeting your gaze when he explained the program to you, as if he was checking the door behind you to see whether he could still walk out. He couldn't. Neither could I. We were both already in the room. Randolph reported a breach in his EVA suit, Anderson told me. He had a folder open on the table, but he wasn't reading from it. He'd memorized it. Memorizing it was his penance. 14 minutes into the surface traverse, he described a sensation, pressure, then warmth, then disorientation. He completed his sample collection. He walked back to the lander. He sealed himself inside the airlock, followed decontamination protocol to the letter, and then he died. Quietly. In about 20 minutes. I asked what killed him. Anderson looked at me for the first time. We don't know yet. That's part of why we need time. And the other part? Funding, congressional review. We have 300 people working on this program. We have 2 more missions in the pipeline. If the news breaks that we lost Randolph on the surface, those missions die. The program dies. And whatever is on that planet, whatever got through his suit, we never find out what it is or where else it might be. He let that sit. Outside the window, the Houston skyline shimmered in the July heat. There's also the Voronov mission, he said. The Soviets. They launched 8 months ago. They'll make the surface in 14 months, give or take. We've been communicating with them unofficial channel scientific exchange. We don't know yet whether what happened to Randolph is a hazard of the surface or something specific to the site he was working. Until we know, we can't warn them without explaining how we know. I understood the architecture of the trap. If they warned the Soviets, they had to explain about Randolph. If they explained about Randolph, the program ended. If the program ended, no one ever went back to find out what was there. And if the Voronov crew landed blind. How long do I do this? I asked. 60 days, maybe 90, long enough for the lab to identify what we're dealing with. He was a good man doing a bad thing. I was a bad man doing a worse thing for reasons I wouldn't examine until much later. I signed where they told me to sign. I flew to a medical facility in Arizona. I spent 11 days in surgery and 40 days learning to be someone else. They had tapes, hundreds of hours Randolph's training session, mission briefings, informal conversations, a speech he'd given at a school in Pasadena 6 months before launch. I watched them until I could recite his cadence, absorb his particular way of going still when he was thinking hard, the slight forward lean he used when he was listening, as if he wanted to get the words a half-second sooner than they'd arrive. He was a serious man, methodical. I liked him watching those tapes. That made it worse. They altered my face in stages, giving the swelling time to resolve between procedures. The surgeon was a cold, efficient woman who addressed me only by my new name from the first session onward. She called me Colonel throughout. I don't know if that was Anderson's instruction or her own private discipline. Either way, it worked. By the 6th week, I caught myself answering to it without a pause. The splashdown went smoothly, which is to say the deception was executed without incident. The Ares III return capsule came down in the Pacific on a Tuesday morning. The press pool was positioned 3 miles from the recovery site, close enough to film the helicopter retrieval, too far to see the second helicopter that brought me in from a Coast Guard cutter 20 minutes before the capsule was opened. John Phillips, the mission commander who'd flown Randolph's body home in the second seat, briefed me for 11 minutes in the hold of a recovery vessel. He was efficient and cold, and he smelled of recycled air, 3 months of it. He looked at me the way a man looks at something that troubles him and cannot be addressed. Then he went up the ladder and I followed him, and we smiled for the cameras from the deck of the ship, and the world cheered for a man who had been dead for 3 months. What they hadn't told me about, in all those planning sessions, was Gail. Anderson had explained the situation in the abstract. Randolph's wife, recently lost a pregnancy, emotionally fragile, kept in the dark for her own protection. He described her as a variable to be managed. He'd said it would be uncomfortable and that I should treat it as another dimension of the mission, and that the cover required nothing of me except normalcy and consistency. He'd said all of this with that same not quite meeting my eyes quality, and I'd filed it under things I would handle when they arose. She was waiting on the tarmac at Ellington. I should tell you what I saw, because I need you to understand why everything that came after happened the way it did. She stood apart from the official delegation, slightly behind the line of agency personnel, as if she'd placed herself where she could be found without making a display of it. She was wearing a gray dress and she was not crying, which surprised me because I'd expected. I'd built some version of this moment in my imagination, and it had involved tears, and I'd rehearsed how to receive them. She wasn't crying. She was watching. Her eyes found me when I came down the boarding stairs, and she waited, composed and still, and I crossed the tarmac toward her with Randolph's walk and Randolph's posture and Randolph's face, and she put her hands on my arms and looked at me for a long moment and said nothing. That look, I've replayed it 10,000 times since. There was something in it I couldn't name that first day, a question she hadn't yet formulated, a vibration at the edge of recognition, like a sound too low to hear but felt in the chest. She didn't know yet, but some part of her knew that she didn't know, and that part was paying very close attention. The first week was the worst. We lived in Randolph's house, her house, their house, a low white ranch-style place in a quiet neighborhood west of the facility. There were framed photographs in every room. Randolph accepting his commission. Randolph at the base of a Saturn rocket in his flight suit. Randolph and Gale on what looked like a hiking trail somewhere green and cold, both of them laughing at something off camera. I moved through those rooms like an archaeologist who'd been hired to impersonate the culture he was studying. I was careful. I was thorough. I made none of the mistakes they'd trained me to avoid. But there were things they hadn't trained me for because they hadn't known to train me. Small things. The way she made coffee and set one cup at the left side of the counter without thinking, because that was where Bryce had always taken it, and I'd have to reach across her to get it right-handed. The book she'd left open on the nightstand, a history of polar exploration, which I'd have to pretend to have been reading. The particular frequency of the silences between us, the quality of them, which she would know better than any photograph or flight record. She was patient. That was the thing that frightened me most. She wasn't confrontational or brittle. She was patient in the way of someone who is gathering evidence. About 10 days in, she asked me about a hiking trip. We were eating dinner. She cooked well, carefully, and I suspected that cooking was one of the ways she managed whatever she was feeling, and she asked, almost casually, whether I remembered the trail to some lake in Colorado. I'd studied maps of Colorado. I'd memorized the names of mountains and parks and passes, but she said the name of the lake in a way that suggested it was their name for it, a private name, and I had a half-second to decide. I told her I remembered it. She nodded and said that was funny, because she'd been thinking about it all week, and described it to me. The way the light came down through the lodgepoles in the late afternoon, the cold that came off the water even in August. She described it carefully and watched me as she described it, and I agreed with everything she said. And when dinner was over, she washed the dishes and I dried them, and neither of us spoke, and I felt the architecture of the lie shifting under my feet. I reported to Anderson the next day. I told him she was suspicious. He told me to hold the line. He said the lab was close. He said 60 days was still the target. 60 days came and went. Then 90. Then something changed. Not in the lab, not in the program, but in me. It happened on a Saturday afternoon when I was sitting in the backyard reading a technical manual I had no particular reason to read, because Randolph would have read it, and I was still performing Randolph even when no one was watching. She came out with 2 glasses of iced tea and sat in the other chair and didn't say anything for a while. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler ran. She said, not looking at me, "I know you're not Bryce." I'd been waiting for it, and it still stopped my heart. "I've known for about 3 weeks," she said. "I don't know who you are. I don't know why they did this. I know it means Bryce is dead, because this is the kind of thing you only do when someone is dead and you can't say so." She set her glass down on the arm of the chair. "I'm not going to do anything about it. Not yet. I just wanted you to know that I know." I sat there for what felt like a very long time. The sprinkler ticked. A car passed on the street. "His name was Bryce Randolph," I said, "and he died on the surface 14 minutes into his traverse. They think something got through his suit, something from the ground." She didn't cry. I'd half expected that too. She was still and quiet for a moment, and then she asked, "Did he know he was going to die?" "He filed his report," I said. "He sealed the airlock. He followed every protocol. Whatever happened to him at the end, he did his job first." She picked up her glass again. "That's what he would have done." What came after that was stranger and harder than anything they'd trained me for, because it was real. The performance ended and something else began, something I don't have a clean name for. Not love, not exactly, though it moved in that direction over the weeks that followed. Honesty, maybe. The relief of not pretending. She called me Eddie quietly when we were alone. She didn't ask me much about who I'd been before. I think she sensed it was a painful country and she wasn't ready to travel there. What she wanted, I slowly understood, was simply the absence of the lie. And I wanted to give her that. For the first time in 3 years, I wanted to give someone something. But the program was still running. Anderson still called. The lab was still working. And one afternoon, about 4 months into what was supposed to be a 60-day operation, a boy 9 or 10 years old, a neighbor's kid who'd seen me on television, knocked on the door with a piece of paper and a pen and asked for an autograph. I signed it. I signed it as Bryce Randolph because I was still performing Bryce Randolph for the world outside that house, and the boy looked at the signature and then said, "The way children relay information, flat and matter of fact. My dad says the Russians are going to Mars. He said they'd just announced it. Launch window in 6 months. They'd been tracking it on the news. His dad thought it was exciting." I thanked him for the information. I stood in the doorway after he left, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, a cold, specific fear that had nothing to do with myself. That night I told Gail. She already knew about the Voronov mission in the abstract. It had been news before the launch, the Soviets announcing their program, the orbital insertion reported in the papers. She hadn't connected it to Bryce, to what I'd told her in the backyard, to the thing in the Martian soil that had gotten through his suit in 14 minutes. When she connected it now, she went very still. "They haven't warned them," she said. "No, because warning them would mean explaining." "Yes." She looked at me for a long time. "How many people on the Voronov crew?" "3. Their names are Volkov, Petrov, and Lebedev." I'd looked them up in those first weeks, when Anderson had mentioned the Soviet mission. I don't know why I'd remembered their names. Maybe I'd known, even then, that they would matter. "They'll die," she said. It wasn't a question. "If they land at the same site, or anywhere with the same subsurface conditions, probably yes. It depends on what it is, whether it's localized, whether it responds to movement or pressure or body heat. We don't know enough." Does Anderson know enough? He knows enough to know he doesn't want to know more. Knowing more means deciding. She stood up from the table. She walked to the window and looked out at the street for a moment and then turned back. "What happens if you go to him?" "He manages it, stalls. The lab is close," he says. "The lab has been close for 4 months. And if you go over him?" "I don't exist," I said. "Legally, officially, I don't exist. Eddie Reese has no active status with any government agency. Bryce Randolph is alive and healthy and living in this house. If I walk into a senator's office or call a reporter, they don't see a whistleblower. They see a man who had surgery to impersonate a hero. They see the cover-up, not the warning." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about the real Bryce Randolph?" I hadn't told her that part. I hadn't known that part until Anderson had mentioned it briefly, 3 weeks in, that the original contingency plan had included Randolph himself, that he'd known the backup existed, that he'd reportedly agreed to his own classified death in advance as part of mission protocol. And that, according to Anderson, Randolph had not, in fact, gone quietly, that somewhere in the chain of this operation, the real man whose face I was wearing had found out about the Voronov mission and had made a phone call. I told her. She sat back down. "He's alive," she said. Anderson said classified. He said protected. He wouldn't say more. Then he could tell them, if Bryce is alive. "Gail," I said her name for the first time without the odd self-consciousness that had accompanied it for months. "If Bryce is alive and talking, Anderson already knows. Anderson knew before I did. The question isn't whether someone is making noise. The question is whether anyone is listening." She looked at me across the table. "Eddie," she said, 3 people are going to land on that planet." I knew what she was asking. I'd known since the boy with the autograph book, if I'm honest with myself. I'd known since the backyard, since the iced tea, since I'd watched her absorb the death of her husband with that quiet, gathering stillness. I'd known since the loading dock in Galveston, maybe, since 3 names I'd memorized out of guilt, the school teacher, the 2 men at the tire shop, Because the only thing that had kept me functional in those 2 years of freight and silence was the discipline of remembering the cost of a wrong decision made quickly. This was the math. I had nothing. I was legally nothing. I was a man wearing another man's face, living in another man's house, in love with another man's widow, and that last part I was only now willing to name clearly, even inside my own head. If I moved, the cover broke. If the cover broke, the program was exposed, Anderson was finished, and the investigation would grind through every ugly corner of the last 4 months. I would lose everything I'd been given. The house, the quiet evenings, the coffee on the left side of the counter, the name Gail said in the dark that was not Bryce's name and not mine, and was somehow both. And 3 people would live. Volkov, Petrov, Lebedev. Their names had the same weight as the others, the ones from the tire shop, the school teacher. I'd ejected once to save myself, and I'd spent 2 years in a gutter learning that it wasn't a trade I could live with. This was the same problem from the other direction. I called Anderson at 11 that night. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he was still awake, which told me he was already worried. The Voronov crew launches in 6 months, I said. A pause, that's correct. You haven't warned them. Eddie. The lab has been closed for 4 months. I want you to tell me right now on this phone whether the lab is actually going to produce something actionable before that window closes. Don't tell me what you hope. Tell me what you know. A longer pause. The quality of silences carries information, and this one told me everything. We have theories, he said. We have significant progress. Anderson, I let his name sit between us, 3 people. I know how many people. Then you know what this is. He didn't answer immediately. I could hear him breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had a different texture. The tightness around the eyes translated to audio. A good man doing a bad thing who'd known for some time that the bill was coming. If I warn them, he said, I have to explain the source. If I explain the source, I know the cascade. The program ends, Eddie. Everything we've built ends, I said. Or 3 people die, and we add that to the list of things that ended for other reasons. Another long silence. I need you to understand what you're asking me to do, he said. I understand exactly what I'm asking you to do, I said. I'm asking you to do the harder thing. I'm asking you to call the president and tell him what happened on Mars and what is going to happen to the Voronov crew if he doesn't act. I'm asking you to do it tonight, because 6 months is not as long as it sounds when you're building the diplomatic channel to warn a rival program that the planet you've been racing them to is dangerous. And if I don't? I'd thought about this part. I'd thought about it carefully, because the leverage I had was also the anchor around my neck. Then I call the wire services, I said. I call them as Eddie Reese. I tell them my real name, and I tell them what was done with it, and I tell them that an American astronaut died on Mars and the agency buried it rather than warn the Soviet crew. That story is worse for everyone than the story you tell tonight. You know it is. He went very quiet. I heard him set something down. You destroy yourself, he said. Everything you've built here. I built it on someone else's foundation. I've been living in a dead man's house for 4 months. I'm not under any illusion about what I have. I paused. Make the call, Kurt. I used his first name. I don't know why. It felt like the right register, not hard, not soft, just honest. The thing between us had always been honesty at odd moments. He'd never tried to make the deception noble. He just tried to make it work. I'd respected that in my way. He said he'd call me back. He called back at 2 in the morning. His voice was flat and very tired. I've spoken with the president's chief of staff, he said. It's moving. The diplomatic channel will be opened through back routes, science attachés, not military. The Voronov team will receive a full hazard advisory before their landing window. It'll be framed as new data from our orbital analysis. Incomplete, but enough to ensure they either choose an alternate landing site or take precautions we weren't taking. I asked him what happened to the program. Congressional oversight, he said. Full review. Budget held pending investigation. We'll lose the next mission window probably, maybe two. And Randolph. A pause. Bryce will be officially deceased. Posthumous commendation. Full honors. His family will be informed that he died in service. Another pause. His wife will receive everything she's entitled to. I sat with that for a moment. You should know, Anderson said, that Bryce, the real Bryce he called me 6 weeks ago, told me what you're telling me now. I told him to give me time. His voice shifted. I should have listened the first time. Yeah, I said. What are you going to do? I didn't answer that directly. What I did was hang up and sit in the kitchen for a while in the dark, and then I made coffee, left side of the counter. And I sat down, and I thought about 3 men who didn't know yet that someone had decided their lives were worth more than the program that was sending them to die. Volkov, Petrov, Lebedev. I said their names out loud, alone in the dark kitchen, the way I used to say other names. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't a trade. It was just the practice of remembering that numbers are always people when you get close enough. Gail found me there an hour later. She read my face before I said anything. He's going to do it, she said. He's going to do it. She sat down across from me. She didn't ask what happened next for us, for me, for her, for the complicated geography of what we'd become to each other in that house. There would be time for that, or there wouldn't. There were things that couldn't be answered in a kitchen at 3 in the morning, and she was wise enough not to ask them. What she said was, "What was it, do you think, on the surface?" I'd thought about this more than I could explain. The lab reports that Anderson had shared with me, partial, carefully redacted, described the organism in terms that were carefully neutral, scientifically hedged. A subsurface anaerobic colony, complex protein structures, possible sensitivity to heat differentials, possible sensitivity to the electromagnetic signature of biological neural activity. Possible, and this was the word that stayed with me, possible chemotactic behavior, which was the lab's way of saying it might move toward things it detected. It was old. That much the isotopic dating suggested clearly. Whatever was in the Martian substrate had been there for millions of years, patient in the cold dark, doing whatever it was doing in the absence of anything warm enough and complex enough to notice. Bryce Randolph had been the first thing warm enough and complex enough to notice. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the danger of it, not the tragedy of how he died, but the sheer alien quality of a thing that had waited in geological silence, until one day a creature came down from the sky and walked across the ground above it, and the thing registered something, not thought, not intent, nothing like curiosity in any form we'd recognize, but some response, some ancient chemical gradient shifting. It hadn't meant to kill him. That was the thing. It hadn't known what he was. It was operating on instructions laid down before the first fish crawled out of any ocean on any planet, instructions that had nothing to do with men or ambition or the space race or congressional budgets or any of the human noise that had surrounded his death. It was simply doing what it did. It was simply there. And we were simply there too. That was the HFY of it, if I can call it that, though I'm not the kind of man who uses words like that, and it makes it sound triumphant when it wasn't. It was just a fact. We'd gone to Mars. We'd taken a loss we hadn't expected from something we hadn't understood. We'd responded by doing what humans always do. We'd gotten frightened and small and political for a while. We'd let the fear make our decisions, and the decisions had nearly cost 3 more lives. And then we hadn't, that's the part. We hadn't, finally. At the last turn, at the point where the whole system was optimized to stay silent and stay funded, 2 people in a kitchen and a tired man with a phone had decided that the cost was too high. Not because the math was clean. The math wasn't clean. The program took the hit. Anderson's career took the hit. My borrowed life ended. We'd done it because the alternative was unacceptable. Because letting 3 people die in the dark to protect a budget is the kind of thing that hollows a person out until there's nothing left. And we'd both done enough of that kind of hollowing. Anderson with his 4 months of silence, me with my 2 years in Galveston, and neither of us had any more room for it. The Voronov mission received its advisory 4 months before landing. The diplomatic channel held. They changed their landing site to a location 200 kilometers north of the original, based on the hazard data. They landed safely. Grigory Volkov stepped onto the surface of Mars and said something that I didn't catch because I heard it in Russian, and my Russian was never good, but the translator on the radio said he called it magnificent. I heard that from a small house in a different city, a long way from Houston. The program review ran 14 months. Anderson testified. The full story came out in stages, not all at once, but in the grinding, unglamorous way that things come out in bureaucratic investigations, where every revelation is partial and contested, and nothing is as clean as the newspapers make it sound. My name appeared in documents, not prominently. The agency had ways of managing that. What emerged was the essential outline. An astronaut died on Mars. The agency covered it up. The cover-up was broken by internal pressure before it could become a catastrophe for a rival crew. Bryce Randolph received his commendation. His name went on a wall at the facility. It deserved to be there. He was the first human being to set foot on another world, and he did it with no guarantee of coming home. And when something went wrong, he filed his report and sealed his airlock and followed every protocol. That's the story that should be told about him. I'm telling it now. What happened to me is less interesting, and I'll keep it brief. There were procedures, the legal kind, not the surgical kind, that addressed the question of Eddie Reese's official status. Anderson had some residual influence in the right places and used it carefully. I didn't go to prison. I didn't go back to Galveston. The agency's obligation to its operational assets includes a quiet kind of accounting that happens after the lights go down and the review boards go home. And that accounting produced a number and a set of documents and a small house in a city I'd chosen because I didn't know anyone there. Gail moved to Colorado. We wrote letters. Not email, she was from the generation that wrote letters, and I'd adopted that habit in those months in her house along with a few others. The letters were careful at first, practical. How are you? What are you doing? The weather has been. Then they became something else. They became the kind of letters that take a long time to write because you're trying to say something true without being reckless with it, which is harder than it sounds when you're a man who spent 2 years not saying anything and 4 months saying everything false. I'm not going to tell you how that resolved itself. Some things don't need to be part of the official record. What I want to tell you, the thing I've been building toward, because I'm old enough now to know that stories need to land somewhere worth landing, is what I thought about when I heard the news about the Voronov landing. When Volkov said magnificent in Russian, and the translator caught it, and I was sitting in a small house in a city where nobody knew my name or my face, or what I'd done with either. I thought about the thing in the soil. I thought about how old it was, and how it had waited, and how it had done what it did without malice or intention, operating on rules laid down before the first cell divided in any ocean anywhere. And I thought about how we'd responded, not heroically, not cleanly, but eventually. Eventually, we'd looked at the math and decided the human lives on the other side of the ledger mattered regardless of their nationality, regardless of the program and the budget and the cold arithmetic of the space race. That's a small thing, maybe. 3 lives. A phone call at 2 in the morning. A tired man making a decision he should have made weeks earlier. But the thing in the soil didn't know what it had started. It didn't know that it had sent a signal up through the substrate and through Bryce Randolph's suit and into the full, complicated, irrational machinery of human response. And that the machinery, after grinding through its fear and its politics and its budget reviews, had eventually, stubbornly, characteristically produced an answer that kept 3 men alive. The organism had been patient for millions of years. We'd managed a little over 4 months. And in those 4 months, 2 people in a kitchen had decided that the line between who we protect and who we let die is not a line that runs along national borders or program affiliations. It runs somewhere else, somewhere internal, and once you've found it, you can't unfind it. You carry it around with you forever, that line, and it costs you every time you honor it, and the cost is worth paying. I know that now. I knew it dimly in Galveston in the way you know things you can't yet say. I know it cleanly now, the way you know things you've earned. The shuttle made its landing in the Martian north. The cameras caught Volkov coming down the ladder, his white suit bright against the pink sky, moving carefully, checking the surface with each step, taking nothing for granted. "Magnificent," he said. He was right. I've had years now to sit with what happened, and the shape of it changes depending on where I stand when I look at it. From one angle, it's a story about a program that lied, got caught, and paid. That version is accurate as far as it goes. The review board found what it found, the agency restructured. The next Mars mission was delayed by 3 years. Anderson resigned before he could be pushed, a distinction he insisted on, and one I respected because it was the last act of a man trying to leave on his own terms after a long season of acting on other people's terms. He wrote me once afterward. Brief. He said the right call had been made even if it had been made late, and that he didn't expect me to disagree with that assessment. I didn't write back. Some debts between people aren't settled in correspondence. From another angle, it's a story about the organism. I've read everything the lab published, once the review ended and the seal on the science came off. The papers were dense and careful and avoided the kind of language that would make the news, but if you read closely enough and knew what to read for, the picture that emerged was genuinely remarkable. The thing in the Martian substrate, they called it a hypolithic permeant colony, a phrase that tells you nothing and everything at once, was not simple. Not an organism in any sense that maps cleanly onto Earth biology, not a virus, not a bacterium, something older than either, something that had adapted to extreme cold and radiation and the long dark by developing properties we didn't have words for yet. The sensitivity to bioelectric fields was real, not imagined. The lab confirmed it in controlled conditions. It responded to neural activity the way some deep-sea organisms respond to light, not with intent, but with something that looked enough like intent to matter. What killed Bryce Randolph was not the organism doing what it was designed to do. What killed him was the extraordinary accident of being the first warm, complex, neural thing to walk across the ground above it in what the isotopic data suggested was somewhere between 400,000 and 2 million years. He was first contact. He just didn't know it, and it didn't have a concept of contact, and the result was a death that nobody had a good framework for. Not tragic in the way we usually mean, not intentional in any way, just collision. 2 things moving through space and time on trajectories that had nothing to do with each other until they intersected. The Voronov team landed 200 kilometers north, in terrain that the subsequent orbital spectroscopy confirmed had a different subsurface profile, less permeability, less moisture gradient, less of whatever conditions the colony needed to migrate upward toward the surface boundary. They worked for 6 days and came home clean. Their surface samples contained nothing anomalous. Their report acknowledged the hazard advisory and commended the cooperative framework that had produced it, in the careful diplomatic language that scientific papers use when they're describing political things. Volkov gave an interview afterward. Someone asked him whether he was afraid when he'd heard about the revised hazard data just months before landing. He thought about it for a moment. I watched the clip 3 times, and each time I appreciated how seriously he took the question, and he said yes, he'd been afraid. But fear, he said, was information. Fear told you what to pay attention to. The question was not whether to feel afraid, but what to do with it. I've kept that. Here's what I know about the thing in the Martian ground, 4 years on. It's still there. The program resumed. 2 more crewed missions have operated in the northern region, and a separate unmanned mission placed sensors within a kilometer of the original Ares III landing site. The readings are consistent. The colony is active, meaning it's alive in whatever sense that word applies, and it's large, distributed across a subsurface area that the models now estimate at roughly 6,000 square kilometers around the Tharsis region. It's been there a very long time. It may be the only life on Mars, or there may be others. We don't know. What we know is that it's there, and we're going back. That part doesn't surprise me. That part is entirely predictable, entirely human. We lost a man to it, and we covered it up, and we nearly let it kill 3 more. And now we're building better suits and better sensors and better protocols, and we're going back anyway, because that's what humans do. We find something that nearly kills us, and we study it until we understand it, and then we go back and do the thing we were trying to do in the first place, with more knowledge and less arrogance. And this is the part the aliens, if there are any watching, must find either admirable or baffling, without ever entirely losing the capacity for awe. The Voronov landing footage ends with a wide shot from a camera mounted on the lander's superstructure. A long overhead angle, the Martian plane stretching out toward the horizon, and Volkov and his crewmates tiny in their white suits against all that rust and silence, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of people who know what the ground might hold and choose to walk on it anyway. Magnificent, he said. There are worse last words for a species than that. I live quietly. I have the letters and the small house, and enough of a pension that I'm not hauling freight. I have the memory of 4 months in a kitchen I had no business being in, with a woman I had no right to know, being honest about things I should have been ashamed of sooner. I have the names, all of them, the old ones and the new ones, and the discipline of remembering that numbers are people when you get close enough. The thing in the soil doesn't know any of this. It doesn't know that the warm, complex, neural thing that walked above it and died was the leading edge of a species that would spend the next several years learning how to walk above it without dying, and would then keep walking anyway. It doesn't know that Bryce Randolph's death produced a decision that kept 3 men alive, and that the decision was made not by generals or presidents, but by a disgraced pilot and a widow in a kitchen in Houston at 3 in the morning, drinking coffee on a Tuesday. It's been waiting in the dark for 400,000 years. It has no concept of what it started. But I do, and now you do. That's enough. Though I suppose I should say one more thing, because I've been leaving out a piece and I'm aware of it. And leaving things out is how I lived for 2 years in Galveston, and it doesn't suit me anymore. Anderson called me once more about 8 months after the review ended. Not official business, not a report. He called on a Sunday evening, and I could hear in his voice that he'd been working up to it for a while. He told me that in the final weeks before the program review went public, when the agency's lawyers were negotiating the shape of the disclosure, there had been a question about the impersonation, about what to do with the fact that a man had been surgically altered and planted in another man's life for 4 months. There were people, he said, who wanted that part of the story folded into the classified annex and kept out of the public record entirely. Tidier that way. Fewer uncomfortable questions about what the agency had been authorized to do and to whom. He'd argued against it. He told me he'd argued that the full record should stand, including the part where a disgraced pilot with nothing to lose had been handed a dead man's face and asked to do an impossible thing, and had done it imperfectly but ultimately in a way that mattered. He said he'd made the argument not because it protected me. The classified annex would have protected me better, in a narrow legal sense, but because the record should be honest. The lawyers had compromised. My name in the documents, as I mentioned, not prominently, but there. I thanked him. He said, "For what it's worth, you were the only part of this I'm not ashamed of." I told him I'd done a lot of things worth being ashamed of, and he probably shouldn't use me as his benchmark. He laughed. It was the only time I heard him laugh. It was a good laugh, tired and genuine, and not at all forced. The laugh of a man who's been through something and come out the other side, and is surprised to find he still has a sense of humor. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. A news story, the weather, whether the Ares program would recover in time to make the next conjunction window. He thought it would. I told him I hoped he was right. He said he thought I meant that. I told him I did. That was the last time we spoke. Some people walk through your life briefly and reshape it without meaning to, and Anderson was one of those. He'd recruited me for the worst reasons, managed me for the worst purposes, and at the last turn had made the call I'd needed him to make. I don't think that balance sheet adds up to something clean, but I've stopped needing it to. What I think about instead, when I think about Anderson, is the image I have of him making that call to the president's chief of staff at 11 at night, sitting in an office or a kitchen of his own, phone in his hand, 4 months of careful silence about to become something irreversible. The moment before the call and the moment after are different worlds. He chose to move between them. That's what it looked like from where I was standing. From the outside, it looks like a bureaucrat making a phone call. From the inside, it looks like a man deciding who he is. I made a version of the same decision from a loading dock in Galveston when I said yes to the 2 men in the sedan, and again in the kitchen when I picked up the phone, and I've been living with the consequences of both. The consequences of the first were complicated. The consequences of the second I've mostly made my peace with. The ones I'm still working through are older and quieter and have nothing to do with Mars. You carry what you carry. You put it down where you can and you carry the rest. Volkov's footage runs 43 seconds in the version I watch. The wide shot from the lander, the 3 figures on the rust-colored plane, the horizon impossibly far away because the planet is smaller than ours, and the curve comes sooner. They're moving carefully, deliberately, 1 step at a time, checking the ground with each footfall the way you do when you know something about the ground that you didn't know before. They don't look frightened. Or if they do, fear is information, Volkov said that, and they're using it well. 43 seconds. 3 humans on another world, alive because of a phone call and a kitchen, and 2 people who hadn't earned the right to make a decision for the ages but made it anyway. Because that's what was in front of them and there was no one else. Magnificent. That word was meant for the planet, I know. The silence and the scale of it, the weight of being the first thing with a heartbeat to stand in that particular spot in 400,000 years. That's what Volkov was calling magnificent. But I allow myself a private reading. I allow it because I was there in my way. I was the instrument that got bent to a purpose and then turned around and bent back against it. And whatever I am now, Eddie Reese, no rank, no facility, small house, quiet city, letters from Colorado on the 1st of every month. I was part of this. And it ended the way it ended, and 3 people are alive. The organism in the Martian soil has been waiting 400,000 years. The next crew is in training. The suits are better. The sensors are better. We're going back. Of course we are. That's us, that's the whole story. That's what we do. Phillips came to see me once. John Phillips, the mission commander who'd flown home with Bryce Randolph's body in the second seat. I hadn't expected that. I hadn't thought about him much, to be honest. He was a peripheral figure in the months I'd lived inside the program, someone who appeared at the edges of briefings, and then at the center of that 11-minute handoff on the recovery vessel, smelling of recycled air, and looking at me like a troubled man looking at something he couldn't address. He found me through channels I don't need to explain, showed up on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, drove a rental car with out-of-state plates. He was a compact man, older looking than the mission footage had suggested, with the same quality of compressed precision I'd associated with career military personnel who'd been somewhere that changed the scale of things. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. He said he wanted to tell me what it was like. The return flight. I hadn't asked, and he offered it anyway, and I understood that he'd been carrying it for 8 months and needed a place to put some of it. He said the capsule had a very specific smell after 90 days, antiseptic and metal, and the particular staleness of recycled atmosphere that doesn't fully flush no matter how many times you cycle it. He said Randolph had been in the second seat in a sealed container, and that the weight distribution required for the return trajectory had meant the container was positioned directly behind Phillips during re-entry. He said he'd spent 6 hours thinking about that. He said Randolph had been a good man, serious and methodical, like the tapes had shown me. He'd been good company in the way that serious, methodical people are good company, reliable, consistent, never performing. Phillips had known him for 3 years of mission training, and he said that in all that time he'd never seen Randolph be dishonest about anything, not even the small social dishonesty that most people do automatically to smooth the friction out of daily life. That detail stayed with me. I thought about the moment the TV signal had gone to static. Randolph down there on the surface, suit breached, something from the soil working its way through the layers of his protection, and him filing his report, walking back to the lander, following protocol, not because he didn't understand what was happening, but because he was a serious, methodical man who didn't perform, not even at the end. 14 minutes. Phillips sat with me for 2 hours. He didn't ask me anything about the impersonation, not what it was like, not how Gail had been, not what the house had looked like, or what I'd felt wearing someone else's face. He seemed to understand that those weren't his to ask. What he wanted was to tell the story of the return flight to someone who would understand why it mattered, and I was that person because I'd spent 4 months becoming the person who would understand. Before he left, he said one thing that I've turned over many times since. He said he knew about the backup plan, the impersonation protocol. We all knew. It was in the mission brief, not as a moral question, just as a contingency. What happens if the astronaut dies but we need to preserve public confidence and program funding? It was framed technically, like a bad weather protocol. He stopped. I waited. I asked him once. This was about 6 months before launch. We were doing systems drills and we had a long hold and we were just talking. I asked him what he thought about it. The contingency. He said he'd thought about it for a long time and decided he didn't have the right to object to it, because the program was bigger than him and the mission was bigger than the program. And if his death needed to be managed for the benefit of what came after, that was the deal he'd made when he signed up. Phillips looked at the table for a moment. Then he said one other thing. He said, "The only thing I'd ask is that whoever they put in the suit is decent to Gail. She didn't sign up for any of this." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I could. Phillips stood up. He put on his jacket. He said it had been good to meet me, and he said my real name, Eddie Reese, which was the first time anyone had said it to me in almost a year, and he left. I sat at the table for a long time after that. I'd like to think I was decent to her. I'd like to think that the 4 months in that house, difficult and strange and dishonest as they were, I'd been decent to her in the way that Randolph, who'd never met me, who'd been dead for months before I wore his face, had hoped that whoever they found would be decent to her. I don't know whether I earned that assessment. That's not mine to decide. But I'd like to think it. The letters come from Colorado on the 1st of every month. They're not short letters. They're the kind of letters that take time to write because you're trying to say something true, and true things take longer than false things because false things can be any shape and true things have to fit what actually happened. I write back on the 15th. I'm not a natural writer. I was a pilot. I think in instruments and trajectories, but I've gotten better at it. She writes about hiking, about the light in the lodgepoles in late afternoon, about the cold that comes off mountain water even in August. I write back that I'd like to see it. And one day I will. There's one last thing I want to say about the organism itself. The lab's working name for it, before the formal taxonomy committee got involved, and gave it a designation that takes up 3 lines in a journal, was simply the colony. They capitalized it. I think that was instinctive, the way you capitalize something you don't fully understand and want to mark as significant, the way you capitalize God or the war or the storm. Calling it the colony acknowledged its scale without claiming to understand its nature. The imaging data from the orbital sensors showed the distribution across the Tharsis region as a network, not uniform, not random, but patterned in a way the geologists kept trying to map against subsurface water or volcanic activity or impact debris, and couldn't quite fit to any of them. It was its own pattern, laid down by its own logic over its own timescale, and the edges of it didn't correspond to anything we had a map for. The current working hypothesis, and I read the papers when they come out, I've made a point of it, is that the colony is a survival mechanism from a period when Mars was warmer and wetter, and there was something for it to have evolved alongside. That Mars had biology. That the biology is mostly gone now, extincted out by the slow death of the atmosphere and the water, and what's left is the colony, which adapted to survive conditions that killed everything else, and has been doing so for an amount of time that strains the imagination even when you're sitting quietly with your coffee trying to hold the number in your head. Something was alive on Mars. It's still alive, some of it. And one day, a man from Earth came down from the sky and walked above it, and it responded, and the man died, and everything that followed, the cover-up and the kitchen and the phone call, and the 3 men in white suits moving carefully on the rust-colored plane. Everything that followed was the consequence of that first contact between 2 things that had no concept of each other. We have a concept of it now. That's what science does. It builds concepts for things that previously had none, and the concepts change how you move through the world and how you protect the people moving with you. Bryce Randolph was the first. He didn't come home. But what found him, is being understood now, slowly, carefully, by people in laboratories who are building the knowledge that will let the next crew walk safely, and the crew after that, and the ones after them, until walking on that surface is as routine as walking on any ground, as safe and as deliberate and as full of wonder. That's the inheritance he left. Not the commendation on the wall, not the story that got managed and reviewed and partially declassified. The inheritance is the knowledge, the data, the reason the suits are better and the sensors are better and the protocols are better. He walked into the unknown at 14 minutes into his traverse, and he filed his report, and he sealed his airlock, and he did his job. And everything we know about the colony we know in some part because of those 14 minutes. I think about that. I think about a man on a ladder, coming down to a surface no human had ever touched, looking out at the plane stretching away toward the horizon, and not knowing yet what was in the ground below his feet. Not knowing and going anyway, because that's what the mission required, and he was a man who didn't perform, not even at the end. Magnificent. He said the words they'd prepared for him, the public words, the ones the world heard. But I think the real words, the ones that mattered, were the ones in the report. The ones he filed while the thing from the soil was working through his suit. Careful, methodical, precise. Bryce Randolph describing exactly what was happening to him so that someone later would understand. So that the next crew would know. So that Volkov and Petrov and Lebedev could land 200 kilometers north and walk on the surface and come home. That's what the mission was, not the flag and the cameras and the words for the world. That, a man doing his job completely at the cost of everything, so that the ones who came after him would walk on better ground. I'm not a religious man, but there's a kind of grace in that, a kind of final decency that doesn't ask for recognition, that doesn't perform, that just does the thing that needs to be done because someone has to, and because doing it right is the only way the people behind you survive. Eddie Reese doesn't have a commendation on any wall. That's fine. I had 4 months in a house that wasn't mine, and a phone call at 2 in the morning, and letters from Colorado, and the knowledge that I moved when it mattered and didn't look for a way around the cost. That's enough, that's plenty, more than I earned probably. Volkov called it magnificent. He was right about everything.